Hi everyone, thank you for joining Beyond Insights. We are now on our first episode of season 3, and today we are joined again by Benjamin Rosman, who's a professor in the School of Computer Science and Applied Mathematics at the University of the Witwatersrand, my old university. Benji runs the Robotics, Autonomous Intelligence, look at me messing it up already, and Learning Rail Laboratory, and is the director of the Mind Institute. Also a founder of Lelapa AI and fellow at the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research in their Learning in Machines and Brains program. And most recently, he's been named one of Time's top 100 influential voices in AI. Well, that's a lot to remember with your CV. Thanks so much for joining us.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me back.
Awesome having part 2. So since the last time you were here, you've been named by Time as one of the most influential voices in AI. Can you maybe walk me through what that has been like?
It was a very surreal process, but very exciting to have that kind of global recognition, and I guess to be able to network with some other people, kind of doing similar things and having related ideas around the world. And sure, it gives us more to talk about when my introduction comes up.
Very nice to add in there. In terms of the kind of global vantage, and I suppose you were talking about networking with other people in the space, have you heard some different opinions on AI or different ideas?
I mean, we're in a weird place that like everybody's got all the opinions and ideas on AI, and there's just so many different discussions kind of cross-cutting. What's interesting is that like there's so much noise in the space, but the development's continuing behind the scenes. We see more and more things rolling out in products everywhere, people using things, and so while there's like just more and more hype, I feel every single day, there's also more and more kind of tangible things happening in the real world. Probably these two processes are happening at slightly different speeds, but it's interesting that wherever you go, whoever you talk to, whatever the background is, people have views and opinions on this. And I think that's interesting to me to see, that very different people are able, I mean, maybe not always should be, but able to weigh in on these kinds of questions. And like as a researcher, which is, what I spend the bulk of my time doing, that's great because you get different insights, you get different kind of ideas to think about and work on.
I wonder some of the kind of quieter trends that you've noticed in the AI space that maybe people who are not in the realm of research wouldn't really know about.
I think there's a ton happening. I mean, this is like the fastest growing field in human history. And so, you can look in different ways of how things are going. To me, what's interesting is just, again, how things are happening behind the scenes. So, there've been various reports about, enterprise uptake of AI and how slow it is and that sort of thing. And I think that is true in a sense. At the same time, there's like a lot of standard software people are using that have had more and more features kind of rolling out into them. But really the interesting thing is that every person basically in some way or another is using this technology in their lives that they were probably unaware of like just a few years ago. So that's interesting that like everyone has their own use cases, their own ways that they're personalizing it. To me, this really talks to kind of a success of the field in terms of its grand goals of like generality. Like, for a long time, there was always this discussion about like all of AI is narrow. We build things that do one specific thing, and we're clearly not in that regime anymore because, and you just see that in the way that like you can have several people sitting in the exact same role and they're all using this to do different things. That's been interesting to me, as well as the kind of way that there's this, it's kind of normalized in the public opinion, which I think is pretty interesting that, so you watch like one of these random videos that come up in your newsfeed, and it's of like, I don't know, a lion breaking out of an enclosure and things, and people are like, oh, that's obviously AI because if you see the way that the gravity affects this and this, like 20 seconds into the video. And it's like kind of wild that's like, it's become normalized that this was just a video generated by a machine that, again, a couple of years ago, we thought was maybe 50 years into the future. Like, this is like wild sci-fi. In fact, our wild sci-fi didn't even talk about like crazy AIs that could generate like perfectly synthesized videos that look like reality, except for that tiny little thing over there. And so I think that's interesting, that like just how quickly it's become normalized. And if people see something, they go, wow. And then like 10 seconds later, they just expect it to be delivered on their desk. And like, why is it not working as well as I wanted? I think that's pretty cool, pretty interesting, probably driving the hype as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think that people have this idea that something can be created instantly because you have tools like AI that can help you do so much more than you could do by yourself.
Yeah, and I think this kind of means interesting things probably for our attention economy, where we already wanted to view everything instantly, but now we want to create it instantly as well. And so I suspect in the long run, this is going to be putting like a lot of pressure on like content creators as well, because, you know, why couldn't you give me this thing in 20 seconds like my AI could?
Yeah. I suppose to go back to a bit of your CV, I mentioned the Mind Institute, and you've described the Mind Institute as a place where you can create crazy ideas. And it's a kind of multidisciplinary way of thinking through AI. Why do you think we need crazy ideas?
So Mind is our AI institute at Wits University. And there, that kind of philosophy is to focus very much on kind of fundamental thinking and fundamental research in not just artificial intelligence, but natural intelligence as well. So, you know, we've got a whole cohort of academics involved, ranging from about a third of them are like people that think deeply about the development of AI, but that includes then there's philosophers, there's psychologists, there's different kinds of brain scientists. There's all sorts of interesting people ranging all the way through like ethics and philosophy and policy and all these kinds of things, even brain evolution. Why I think this is important is, you know, there's a certain way that AI is being developed, or the bulk of AI is being developed, right? There's always been a lot of different ideas in AI. People are trying different approaches all the time. But I think it's important to not just be doing what everyone else is doing, and for several reasons, right? So, like, firstly, we're pretty convinced that what everyone's doing isn't the right way to be doing it. We just haven't found better ways to do it yet. And so, you know, there's this aspect of us as a kind of research institute to be saying, you know, we don't just have to rely on this coming from like the global north. There's no reason why we can't be like equal players in the space. And I think for various reasons, ranging from like impact through to like economic value, this is a key thing. But also, you know, when we're thinking about like what should we be doing, like how should we be tackling the problems, these are hard problems. Like building these kinds of systems, like this didn't happen, it feels like it happened overnight, but like really this came off the back of decades of hard work, like following different kinds of philosophies, solving different kinds of problems. Like we need to get inspiration from somewhere, right? And so the thinking here is that, you know, if we go back to what are we trying to do, what are the systems we're trying to build, well, there's systems that can do certain things, and they can typically, the kinds of things we want them to do are the kind of things we already know people can do.
Yes.
And in some cases, certain kinds of animals can do. And so let's try and go back to the source and draw some more inspiration from that, which is really what caused this current wave of AI anyway, was some inspiration from there. But the thinking is that there's firstly a lot more like inspiration we could draw from this. But secondly, when we think about like the safety kind of aspects, I've always said I'm not a fan of like the, you know, thinking about the impact of this technology on society just being in the hands of computer scientists. You know, we can jokingly say a class of people that made their life decisions to work with humans less. You know, I would rather have our social scientists and our ethicists and our philosophers and psychologists, like everybody from different backgrounds involved in these discussions, so that we're building the right stuff. We're building things people need. We're building things that respond in a way that we're kind of, you know, we can recognize in a human-like way as being compatible with our values, with the way we work, this sort of thing. And so like what you want to do is you want to be like innovating with the kind of correct set of inputs, which is typically not what you see happening in the space.
Yeah, definitely. I think having that multifaceted approach is really helpful. You have some different ideas coming through. And you mentioned about making AI better. We ran a LinkedIn poll before today because I was trying to see what people are most interested in hearing about in terms of AI. And the number one question that people had on the poll was, how can we make AI more efficient? And I know if you think about natural intelligence or human intelligence, you could argue it's much more efficient in the sense that we don't have like a whole data center that's dedicated to getting our brain to think. Whereas AI obviously takes a lot more power, takes a lot more electricity or water. How can we make AI more efficient?
So, I mean, I think this is one of the big driving questions. In other ways, it is efficient because, through its parallelization, humans are like not efficient in the sense that, they've got to like muck around on the planet for 20 something years before they become like vaguely competent at like
That's true.
waving their arms and legs around. So like the efficiency is different, but yeah, there's certainly big issues around like things like data, things like the electricity and so on. So, this is something we've always like taken to heart being based in Africa, that this is like, we kind of talk about frugal innovation. We talk about like low resource kind of settings, and this is critical for like, there's some problems like African languages where there's just not a lot of data. There's other problems like being able to do anything out like in rural areas where you don't have a lot of like compute. But then there's just, the average company here, and maybe like, paying for server costs in dollars is just not feasible. Yeah. So like we've always had like been forced to think this way. And I think like this is the thing we should celebrate. Now, funnily enough, a lot of the big tech companies are thinking like this too, although, the trade-off is like, do we buy more power plants or, they still want to try and be efficient about this. But like this is where the human brain is just amazing, or like any natural brain is amazing because it had to fit in like this like small space and like, rely on the energy we can get from chewing on some, I don't know, whatever it is, like lettuce leaves and apples or whatever, right? So, so like that's a big deal. And I think there's a few different ways to think about this. One is like if you've got if you're using the kind of models that exist now, and you're not like going back to first principles and doing like redevelopment and research on that, like I think there's still a lot to be discovered about the best way to use them and the best way to say kind of retrain them for the tasks you might be using in your organization and that sort of thing. So like these questions come down to like, making sure you've got the right data. Can you augment your data in clever ways? Do you have the right kind of pipelining that these things can happen efficiently? What is it that you're fine-tuning or retraining on versus what documents are you giving it that it's got access to for real-time querying, that sort of thing. So I think a lot of these, especially over the last year or two, there've been a lot of like best practices that have been kind of developed in the space, but I think there's a lot more work to be done in that. And I think like we're still to get to the stage where like, someone who's working in maybe a small team in a smallish company is able to like just completely wield this technology to like really like dive in on like some specific problem they care about when they've got their own data and this kind of thing, like to fit all that pipelining together. On the research side, I think there's been this heavy reliance on like transformers, on like the way we currently do large language models. I think that's not like, I think we're trying to get a lot out of them, but I don't think it's the right tool to be used for everything. And I think like where we're going now is more fusions of different kinds of AI models. Like what I work on specifically is things like reinforcement learning, which is about long-term autonomous decision making. It's a very different kind of technology to what we see in like these large language models. And I think kind of in a research sense, where we're going now is more fusing different types of models together. And there's a lot of work on like experimenting with different ways to do that. And that kind of fundamentally comes down to this idea that like your LLMs are fantastic, and they can do a lot of stuff, but much in the same way as like we're not getting them to, like, in a sense, just do maths themselves. They're now relying on, like, they'll use calculator type tools, and the same with coding and so on. Like, it's about like figuring out what the right balance of different tooling is, like figuring out when to use different things, what the correct way to integrate them is. I think that's a bit of a trend we're starting to see more and more people experimenting with. And probably what that's going to mean is a general improvement in efficiency, because like we've got this like mega hammer now, which is definitely like great at hitting certain kinds of nails, but not all nails, right? You probably shouldn't be getting your, much as it can, you probably shouldn't be getting your LLM to like directly do your data analysis for you, that sort of thing. So I think like these are all the different ideas that people are looking at in the efficiency space. It's really about trying to get the most out of your tools and figuring out like what is the right time and the right tool to use at the right time.
Makes sense. I think that segues quite nicely into something that I wanted to ask you in terms of like small businesses or accountants who may be watching or listening to this podcast. How do you know when something is the right task for AI to help you with? How do you know, I don't know, in terms of, even if we think of like in the future, say LLMs get to the point where they are making decisions for you, like what decisions could you sort of trust the technology with? What decisions should always be a human's to make? I suppose maybe divided into like now where we currently are and how you see it in the future.
Yeah, easy questions today, right?
These are the questions I've been thinking of.
So, it's hard because there's like, in general, how do we think about this? And then how do you, like, as an individual, small team, a company, think about this? Now, I often find that there's things that I do that I realize afterwards, oh, my AI could have done this way better than I did, and way faster than I could have, and why did I not do that? So I've tried to get into the mindset of like, whenever I do something, and I suffer through it for some number of hours, and then I finish, and then I like try and get into this kind of practice of then asking myself, how could I have done this using some off-the-shelf AI tools? It was just like with my, day-to-day work and that sort of thing. Now, I like that challenge because it's an interesting kind of question to myself. And then I go and try and like figure out a way to do it. And sometimes, like, obviously time dependent and things, like, put a lot of effort into it and the results aren't great. And then, well, that's probably not a good use for this technology. Other times you might tinker with it a bit and go, wow, I'm impressed at the results. Now, that's a more kind of empirical way to think about this. In general, if you understand what are the strengths and weaknesses of these kind of tools, typically they're not, like, they can do kind of chain of thought reasoning and this sort of thing. They're typically not great at like planning ahead and reasoning through like unseen contingencies and that sort of thing. Like, they can do it if you guide them through it in the right sort of way, but like there's certain strengths and weaknesses that they've got like that. So either understanding that or just like getting hands-on more and more familiar with like their capabilities. So if you've got an idea of like how you might do something, which is also useful because it's like that experiment of like, the thing of like, if you can explain something to your grandmother, then you really understand it, right? So often having to do that means I've had to think about how would I explain to someone else, where that someone else is my LLM in this case, how would I explain to it how to solve this problem? And if I can't do that, then that's not great for me. It often shows up certain things in my own thinking and biases and so on. But as you go through that, you'll find like, oh wait, actually there's this step that I think it's pretty good at from my experience. So I think it's one of those things you want to experiment with quite a lot to figure out like what it can and can't do. Obviously there's other trade-offs, there's cost trade-offs and so on. To some extent, like, they can kind of do anything if you're, depending on how much time you're willing to invest in this and so on. But it's like, where does it make sense? In the same way as if you've got like a team working for you, technically anyone on the team could do anything that anyone else does. It might just be like a lot more teeth pulling to get that to happen. Yeah, and so I think a lot of this comes down to like experimentation, getting more comfortable with it. In terms of decision making and like, what we should let our AIs make decisions on, this is also tough because I think we're going to more and more find people just happily leaving the decision making to their AIs. And like, even though you're supposed to check things. So like what I often recommend to people is treat it as, in a sense, there's risks with anthropomorphizing it, but treat it as a person on your team who's like really smart but really naive. And so if you give them good instructions, they'll do amazing things. If you give them bad instructions, they'll guesstimate their way through things. But like, you're also not going to get this like super excitable intern to like do something and then hand it straight to the client. You're going to want to check it first. And I think like if you just use that as a general rule of thumb, that helps a lot. Now, if you've got this like super excitable person who can do things and you've got to check it and you're checking it every day and like you never have to make much in the way of inputs, I think it's very easy to just like let it slide and then trust it more and more. So I worry this creeping trust issue is going to become a bigger question for people. And it's, in a sense, maybe it's a reasonable thing to do, but like, you probably always want to have that kind of final sign off. That would be like if you've got your self-driving car and technically in the manual it says that, if there's an emergency situation, it's going to require you to take over. But now you're half asleep on the thing because, yes, technically that's true. And then, you have an accident because you weren't paying attention and it told you were supposed to do that, but you didn't, right? I think we're going to get more and more of this kind of situation happening. Now, when is the right time to trust it or not trust it? I don't know. When is the right time to trust different people on your team as well? There's always trade-offs. There's always different aspects to these things. There's always pros and cons. But I think one way or another, I suspect more and more as a kind of civilization, we're going to be offloading more and more things purposefully or accidentally onto AIs for decision making, like over the next few years.
Yeah, makes sense. I was also thinking at what point, like as a manager of people in a team, do you decide I can trust this person to take over everything? Because there's always going to be that element of risk, whether it's a person or AI. So you have to, I don't know, it's a bit of give and take. You always want to review it, but I don't know, if you do anthropomorphize it like that, there's like a point where you go, okay, I've given you enough feedback now that this should be okay.
Yeah, so actually maybe I'm going to predict now that like where people now give tips on prompting, like over the next couple of years, we're going to start getting a whole section in bookstores on like how to manage your AIs. Like it will be all the self-help books that have just like, how to work with your AIs.
Yeah, makes sense. Cool. So a lot of people obviously use things like ChatGPT and Gemini to maybe like summarize an email or help them write up something that they want to share with a client quickly. Do you see AI as moving more into the role of being like a financial controller or something like that in the future, where it doesn't just sort of look at analyses that you've already done and then maybe add a few comments on, oh, this means your cash flow isn't looking so good right now and this could be because of X, to actually taking over the role of a financial professional?
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of what the whole current trend with like AI agents, or I hate to say it, but agentic AI has been about, is like kind of your AI able to actually take action and operationalize stuff. This is a thing that we've been working on for a very long time with different kinds of technologies. But from the very simplest setting, like, in some senses it does this through a human. Like if it says do this thing and the human trusts it, the human will do this thing. So it's kind of like taking the human out of the loop. And in some sense, like most of the predictions that the history of AI and machine learning has been largely about making predictions, right? Whether it's stock prices or whatever, right? This is all in service of human decision making. So it's always been about like decision support in that kind of sense. And I think for the bulk of decisions, it's pretty clear, like if these several conditions are met, that's the correct thing to do. And so I think over the last couple of years, the way that a lot of people have been using AI has been, AI tells me these conditions are met, therefore this thing needs to happen, and I need to then push that button. And I think like we're seeing more and more that people are experimenting with this. I mean, the number of LinkedIn posts and like things of like, I started a company with only me, and and like fundamentally that's what it's getting at, is saying that like if you're able to, because like you've got to be able to think of your company as a task, or your team as like solving one task. It's maybe keep monitoring this, keep it like within these parameters, something like that, and take actions to ensure that like whatever it's supposed to do happens. There's these aspects of like, it's a big task, so it gets broken down. Different people have different roles. Part of those roles involve like trying to understand what's going on in the setting and acting on this. In the robotics world, we always think of this as like the kind of sense, plan, act loop, right? You observe something about the world, that's sensing, you've got your reports coming in, you're seeing what's going on there. You plan, meaning you look at this, you draw some inferences, you guesstimate what's going to happen in the future, you maybe run a few counterfactual scenarios, and then based on that you act and you choose one of these things, right? So like really for decades we've been relying on our machine learning and AI to do this kind of planning and thinking step for us. And really the big gap has been in like the integration into bigger systems. But now we see this with like systems rolled out from like every tech company at the moment. And so, that means that they're more closely integrated into the sensing. And this could be as simple as my LLM can read my emails. And it could be the acting could be as simple as my LLM could write my emails. Now maybe I'm just like hitting the send button at the end, but like that's a tighter and tighter integration that we're seeing. Now, I think the hardest setting would be if these kind of tools were built by completely different companies. In many cases they are, but now there's a lot of partnerships, or the Microsofts and Googles of the world are kind of on both the providing software side and the developing AI side. Other ones that do one or the other form partnerships with each other. And so like it's getting easier and easier through APIs and so on for these things to be better integrated. And I think that's where I'm pretty sure this year we're going to see a huge amount happening of like enterprise uptake of AI, in that like as those kind of partnerships, those interactions get better, that means that like kind of counterpoint was previously you've got your ChatGPT, you've got a browser window open, so you're like doing your work stuff, then you go over there to ask ChatGPT something, then you go back and do your work stuff. But if they're plugged into each other in the back end, there's no reason that you've got to kind of swivel your chair in between those two things. And so if the information you're needing to process is kind of coming through the same tools, the same portals, the same software as where you make those decisions, which is largely how we set up businesses, and they've all got API calls to AIs and things, then I think that's going to happen more and more. So yeah, I think we're in the realm that like probably many jobs, like that, you could automate to some extent currently if you are really good at kind of getting the piping and tubing between your different pieces of software working well. But I think now we're seeing more and more of this movement that it happens more natively, and it's like less of a I need to write scripts to plug the right things into each other, and more about just enable the correct options and we'll do that.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen that in things like Gmail, where you'll be writing something and it says, would you like me to polish that for you?
Yeah.
Someone said they thought they were asking it to turn it into Polish. It's like, would you like me to polish this email? Should I just spruce it up a bit? So I think we'll see that in a lot more different softwares going forward.
I mean, even with that, you'll probably see, so you can set filters, right? And for however long you've been able to set a filter that if an email comes through looking like this, just delete it.
Yes.
Right. And I think probably, and you get your out of office things. And I think we'll get kind of some sort of more and more of the kind of the way I'm describing this is that fusion of like, you could say, okay, if an email comes in where they're trying to sell me a thing, compare it against the rates I'm currently paying, and if it's more, then politely decline. And if it's less, then send that on to the human reads this inbox kind of. So I think you'll probably find more and more of that like integration where like you've got these almost complex filters, and maybe you won't even specify them. It'll learn that from your behavior, that like it'll just reply to emails for you when they're the kind of low risk settings. And then that analogy, I think, will carry over to other parts of software. If something's happening in a business as normal setting, it'll be almost, well, we'll probably just start thinking of it not even as AI, but like I can just apply a fancier filter to it. And then just like the percentage that are like somewhat harder or something will filter through to me. And I suspect that's how these things are going to get rolled out.
Yeah, it makes sense. It'll really cut down on like the amount of time you spend on things like admin.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, we can already see with certain, yeah, what we've all been waiting for. I mean, Sift, for example, has an AI feature where you can set up alerts. Like if your bank balance drops below a certain number or something, you'll get an email saying, "Oh, your bank balance is looking a bit low. Maybe you want to go look at that." So I think more software will probably have features like that. To notify you of some of those more like risky scenarios as well.
Exactly. And then, you add to that. So maybe it's okay if your bank balance drops low and it's a Tuesday at the end of the month because that's when your bill payments go out. And so actually it shouldn't flag that. And then, you can just add more and more layers of complexity until eventually you shouldn't even be specifying these things. It just figures it out. So I think that's kind of the path we're on, is just like, these standard streams where like, you'd get your email, but everything coming in you see. And then, okay, we all at least have the spam filter that like some percentage gets redirected and you don't see. But of the stuff that comes to you, even if it's all useful, it doesn't all require the same amount of your attention, right? And many of them are more mechanical than others.
And in terms of like as an accountant, if you're sort of weeding through all the numbers, you're trying to like check that the data is clean and ready to go for your reports. Do you think that a lot of that is just going to become sort of AI's job, and then move accountants onto and kind of like presenting the findings or making plans with their clients and things like that?
I suspect so. I think probably, you'll go from, if you're doing like completely routine things, right, you can just script that. But the problem is a lot of what most of us do is like routine, but not routine enough that a set of simple rules will catch it. And I think a lot of that, this kind of AI is going to be fantastic at. And again, I think probably what you want is that these like corner cases that are like kind of unusual get filtered through, or like what you're not seeing is all the raw data coming in that you've got to process. It will get processed, put into a report, and maybe you pull up the report plus a bunch of the source data on the side just to like double check and corroborate stuff. So I think that kind of thing's like where we're heading there. And then I think the emphasis then will be more and more on kind of what's the unique value of like the person is maybe like understanding this client very well. And okay, sure, maybe your AI could now be recording your meetings and be incorporating that as well. But like there's something, you've got a long history with these people. You understand that they've got certain preferences that maybe aren't even things that have ever been expressed, but like you just understand they've got a certain way they like to do business, which is again maybe not a written down document. And so you can make sure that whatever's happening is happening in the way that fits with how they like it. Or you can, you're sensitive to how their reporting structures work. Again, maybe it's not a thing that anyone's taken you through in detail that you fed into your AI. Again, that could be possible too. But I think there's like that level of personal interaction, personal relationships. And then, being able to convey the kind of reports across, being able to understand like where something weird is happening, being able to again, tailor it to what's expected or what's needed. And maybe there are still some parts of the kind of calculations that need to be done more manually, but it's not the case of like, it's the standard stuff. This will be like the really bespoke things that maybe only this client needs to think about it that way.
It's kind of like the reading between the lines.
Yeah. I think that's a good way of putting it.
I think that's still that, like, for now, human element.
But they're always watching.
I was watching. I suppose the other concern that people often have with AI is like how accurate it actually is, like how good it is at maths, for example, or when it starts hallucinating answers to things, and how do you check, or can you trust it to be accurate? To what point can you trust it to be accurate?
So the hallucinations thing is interesting, and it's in a sense an artifact of how these kinds of AIs work. And very loosely, because they're kind of somewhat inspired by natural intelligence, the hallucinations arise through like the fact that when it generates stuff, it's not just pulling things from databases and shoving them on the end of each other and concatenating them. It's like producing new things. So this is kind of why like it will always hallucinate to some extent, in the same way that humans do, right? Humans make things up as well. Now, funnily enough, like I view this as kind of critical. This is where creativity comes into the process. Like people always say, oh, machines can't be creative. And then in the same breath, they complain that they're hallucinating. Like, you can't have it both ways. Now, admittedly, you possibly don't want someone being too creative when they're doing your accounting.
Yeah.
When ChatGPT, when the public version first came out, like it was one of the first things I tried, was like asked it to like, how would it help me with my taxes? And I asked it like 5 times the same thing. It gave me different answers, and I was not delighted about this. Now, this is where kind of over time we've learned that like, yeah, if you think of like a large language model as a thing that's just phenomenal at language, like it understands language and it can do some maths because it's read a bunch of stuff that has maths in it, but still like not all maths. And this is where if it just like codes up the questions and like runs the code, that's far more reliable, right? So that's an example of like the LLM using the correct tools to solve a problem. Now, so again, you don't want it hallucinating when there's things that like there should be a very definite answer to. I think something that's useful is, what comes out of these models needs to be checked. But I think often a useful approach isn't to get it to say you need it to do calculations, right? I don't think it's great to always just get it to do those calculations. I think it's good to get it to generate the method that does the calculations, which you can then check and then trust that method, because you've seen like, if you, I don't know, need to get it to like average 2 numbers, just to be simple here, right? If you just ask it like average these numbers, now average these numbers, now average these numbers, you need to check every one. If you said to it, write code to average these numbers, and you looked at the code and the code said, take number 1, add it to number 2, divide by 2, and you check that, like, cool, that makes sense to me. And now if it runs that code on like 1,000 examples of numbers it has to average, you can trust that. And I think just like generally that's a better approach to thinking about this. So it doesn't work with many things, like it works with more like calculation based stuff, but if you can get it to come up with a methodology and then execute that methodology, or you even execute that methodology, you take that code or this process and run it yourself, maybe each step involves using a different LLM or running code or whatever it is. If you can do that, I think it requires much less human intervention and you can trust what it's doing. Obviously, if you need it to write a report that's got references in it, like, now you're going to have to check it hasn't made up references. So it kind of works. This approach works in some ways, but I think for like anything that's more analytical, this is like definitely a better way to go.
The other thing that I often find like a little bit strange, or I don't know if it's concerning, is that a lot of these tools have this kind of sycophantic approach where it feels like they're just really trying to please you. So you'll ask, am I on track with my running plan? It says, yes, you are doing so well. You're really ready for what you're preparing for. And I'm like, am I though? Are you just saying that? And I was wondering, I don't know if you have any thoughts on like including that, yeah, why they kind of speak to you in that way, and whether that actually influences the answers that you get.
So I think, I'm not. I don't know all the reasons behind this, but like the kind of a big thing I think is that if part of the training of these models, like they've gone through different stages of training. One, they've learned just about how language works, and then they learn about how like kind of dialogues work, how they, how two humans would interact, like what would be if I say something, and for you, what would be an appropriate way to respond to that, and you say that, and what's the appropriate way for me to respond, having already mastered like language. And then kind of a third step is if I could respond in multiple different ways, which is the best one that I should use. And like all of these processes to some extent have had human input along the way. Now, like my gut feeling is with like along the way with that, as well as the way that people, it's also often collects data. Like if you're giving a thumbs up or thumbs down or copying answers out, right? It's giving it feedback. And I think people in general like it when something agrees with them.
Yes.
And so I suspect there's a kind of overwhelming bias towards the more positive responses in the way it's been trained. And so that's what's given rise to this. Now, there is a lot of effort, like from the tech companies, to try and make them less sycophantic, because it is kind of annoying and it's not always what you want from it. I mean, you can also, like with the right prompting, get it to not behave in that way. Often the trick of getting it to assume a role of a very critical, like gym trainer, you can work around that kind of inherent bias, but you've got to like put a lot of effort into it. But I think a lot of people get caught up with that sycophancy. I think this leads to like a lot of the kind of schizophrenic type problems that we see arising, where like people end up in these like deluding themselves into thinking that they're the best person in the world at this thing. And it's because like it's just kept like pushing them into maybe like an unstable mental state. So I definitely think the fact that the models do that is not a great thing. And again, like this is a problem people are trying to fix. And I would, we could fast forward 5 years, I wouldn't expect them to be anywhere near as sycophantic as they are now. But for now, I think if you want like good results out of it, you need to kind of twist its arm a little bit and be like, I want you to be extra critical about this.
Tell me exactly how it is.
My life is in danger.
Good tip. The other thing I wanted to ask you about is, so we've been talking like kind of globally about AI, but looking at AI locally and within Africa, I know you've done a lot of work about saying that we should have more control over the kind of things that are being developed. Could you maybe talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think this is an important concept. So, this falls under like AI sovereignty. People have spoken for a long time about like data sovereignty. I think this is important as well. So what I don't mean by this is like, just shun models from other parts of the world. Okay, I think what's important is that we've got enough kind of depth of talent and expertise here, but also in every place, that is able to contribute at like every level of the discussion, and particularly here about like the development of new models and so on. So this is, particularly wearing my university hat, this is a big deal. Now, the reason for that, I think, is multiple fold, but it ranges from everything from like, missing out on economic opportunities if you're not kind of plugged in at that level, right? There's, because of the different kind of socioeconomic situations in different countries, like you might be missing some low-hanging fruit that could actually be then kind of commercialized and become very valuable. You don't want to necessarily be at the mercy of stuff coming from just one or two other countries, because if you're paying, say, $1 subscription fee for some tool that like your company is now dependent on, and then your currency tanks, or there's weird geopolitical things happening, you don't want to be in a situation where that like kind of completely cuts off like something that you're now hugely reliant on. So you want to be in a situation where like you've got, maybe they're not as good, but you've got either local alternatives, or you've got the kind of expertise that, you know, you can figure out, okay, how you most easily pivot to use stuff from another place and so on. And then finally, for like safety and kind of awareness of like the kind of sensitivities in terms of like sociopolitics and so on in your region, you want, you know, it's down to that case of like, you want to make sure you're using the right tools for the right things. And like, I think you want people that are asking questions around what can and can't these models do, more like generally than just within a specific company or a specific application area. You want those kind of people to be in every community, because, you know, you should know if like, ooh, you got several options of models, but like the most recent stats say that's the best one for this kind of task. You also want the local people who are able to say, yeah, but it's completely incapable of dealing with this language, or is completely incapable of being used in this kind of context. And I think, to me, that just means you can't kind of completely have a community of consumers. And I think I've been trying to push this idea that like everyone should be making sure that like in the ecosystem that they're sitting in, like here in South Africa, for example, like we need to be feeding back into the kind of core. This will be your core kind of research people at universities, at research organizations, maybe at a government level, that sort of thing. There should be, you know, it's not going to be at the same scale of people like using these tools, but you want to make sure that there's a good body of people that are able to ask these questions, poke these things, and like provide the kind of support and advice that your consumers of the technology would want.
Yeah, it makes sense. So we're not just providing data from our use of the tools, but we're also part of like shaping them.
Exactly.
Yeah, like being a consumer versus being a manufacturer, having both.
Yeah, totally. Like I think, you know, no community or sub-community should only be a consumer. There should always be a flow back somehow. In some cases that'll be really big, in some cases not so much. But even, you know, down to other questions. So, you know, we talk a lot about like AI safety, which is a hard problem. There's a ton of hard problems there, like different kinds of control of AI, different kinds of safeguards. And like, you know, some people would disagree, but many of us think that like we're nowhere near like having the correct solution to this problem. Now, it may just be the case that it would be easier for the kind of correct global solution to come from a very different kind of from a different place where there's different kinds of value systems and so on. Like, I don't have this view that like something can't be invented in some part of the world. I just think that it's easier for people with certain kinds of backgrounds to make certain kinds of discoveries or form certain kinds of connections. And so, you know, it might be the case that the way we should be thinking about AI safety would come out of more of a South African context, for example, that could then have value globally and might shortcut the process to getting safer AI or more efficient AI. Like, there's no reason that's like one part of the world should have a monopoly on this. In fact, it's always better if you've got like just more voices from different places involved in these conversations.
Well, it's again like the idea behind the Mind Institute. You get lots of different people with different perspectives. And I think that's the best way to find the right solution.
Yeah, exactly.
So I have some rapid fire questions.
All right. Not sure how good I am at rapid fire, but I'll try.
So if you were to look 5 years into the future, do you think we'll be using software, like accounting software? Or do you think that these tools will kind of go into the background of an AI that we just talk to?
No, we're all going to be trapped in the matrix. I mean, I think the general trend is towards more and more kind of user friendliness. I mean, this I think is why LLMs took off, is because you can talk to them in natural language. And I think more and more stuff will be happening under the hood. But like, I don't know, maybe we won't even be doing work jobs anymore, and we'll just be talking to each other, and all of these back-end processes will be happening.
Yeah, maybe it'll all just be integrated into one thing, and we'll have to rethink everything. Ah, that's a very dark note. Let's see what my last one is.
I don't know.
If you had to explain the current state of AI to a client who's terrified of using it, Using a metaphor, what would it be?
Using a metaphor. Again, maybe it's not that original at this point, but thinking of it as like the super talented intern who's got like multiple PhDs and like maybe not the best human skills, no real world experience, just like probably shouldn't be left in a room alone with a client, but can do anything you want if you just make sure it does it properly. That's like the best way I think to describe it. So it's all, I think the tools that you need, the kind of social and cognitive tools you need to think about your AI look more like how you deal with other people than how you deal with Excel. And I know some of my colleagues might disagree with my anthropomorphizing here, but I really think that gives you a better place to stand on everything from like, what can I trust it with to what do my governance guidelines look like? And I think if you have that framing, it's far more useful.
That's really interesting. So invest in your people skills, is what
Exactly.
you say. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast again. This has been really interesting.
Always a
Thank you
pleasure.
everyone for listening, and we will see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.